up on a military base, and I had this deep respect for the American flag. Every day of my life, To the Colors would play over the loudspeakers, and in the evening, the national anthem would begin to sound, and whatever we were doing, we would stop playing tennis, stop playing baseball, stop gooping around, get out of the car if we're in the car, and we would put our hands on our hearts and we would face the nearest flag. And ever since I grew up, and then I was a Boy Scout, Eagle Scout, and we really revered our flag and learned devotion to our God and country as a scout. And so to this very day, during this season, from Memorial Day to Flag Day to Independence Day to Labor Day, I go out and I wave my flag out in front of my house and I put it on its stand on one of the pillars on our front porch. I just love to do that. And not only do I place my flag out there on the front porch, the whole process of bringing it out for me is an exercise of prayer. I like to do what the Apostle Paul told young Timothy to do in his first letter to this young minister in the church of Ephesus. He says to Timothy, pray in every way that you can, through thanksgiving and through intercessions, and lift up your government officials so that you can live in a land of peace, in godliness, and with dignity for all. And so I like to follow that advice of Timothy's when I'm out putting my flag up on my house. I like to pray for our nation and for our leaders. And as I do that, just recently I was thinking, as I was reading through Acts, of how Paul, who wrote these words to Timothy, must have been thinking about the experiences he had in Jerusalem, where there was this violent group of religious fanatics that wanted to kill him, and how he had appealed to the benefits of his citizenship to save his very life when he was in Jerusalem. And he must have been thinking about this stuff that Luke tells us about in our text today. There is this whole section of Acts that stretches from Acts chapter 21 all the way through Acts chapter 26 that describes in detail Paul's experience of being a Roman citizen and claiming his citizenship in order to save his neck. And it seems to me that we all have experiences where we might get a little frustrated with a government agency. We might get a little frustrated with court that we have to go appear before on April 15th. I know most people I know are a little frustrated just in general for some reason or another. And so I think that a text like this can really help us to reflect on how we deal with our own citizenship in our country, and especially when things aren't going all that right, when we're in a difficult situation. In our text today, we have the first time that Paul really appeals to his benefits as a citizen when he's in this hard situation. We've studied what's gone on in chapters 21 and the first part of chapter 22. People are out to kill him. He returns to Jerusalem, and all his hopes that the Jewish nation would want to come to Christ as the fulfillment of their national religious destiny is not fulfilled. In fact, many people are very resistant to the message of Christ, and there's a whole group of people that wants to kill him. And last week we looked at this section where this riot churns up outside of the temple in Jerusalem. And in our scene before us today, in Acts 22, we have Paul arrested. He's in chains. His arms are stretched out. there is a Roman soldier behind him with a flagrum in hand. This is a whip, the same kind of whip that the official soldiers had that scourged Jesus. And this flagrum is a multi-strapped kind of whip with pieces of glass and metal embedded in the leather. And it's designed to rip open the skin and to cause maximum pain so that the prisoner will talk. And so there's another soldier standing up in front of Paul with an ear to Paul's mouth, ready to hear what Paul might say. What is the reason for these riots that have occurred in the streets? And finally, at this moment, as Paul is poised for this flogging, he says to the centurion whose ear is at his mouth, "Is it legal to scourge a Roman citizen?" And you kind of wonder, is this the first time he said this? I mean, hasn't he thought of saying this a little bit sooner? But I think you have to think of the situation that he's in to just get a sense of what's happened here. Because it could very well be that he's been screaming, "I'm a Roman citizen, I'm a Roman citizen." But in the midst of the whole riot, nobody is listening to him. Emotions are flaring, people are making decisions, and things are just going crazy. I have a friend, an associate pastor of mine, who was a colleague of mine in New Jersey, who married a girl from Ohio. He was older than me, and his wife, both of them older than me. She was a student at Kent State University, and on May 4th, 1970, she was walking to one of her classes across the common greens, and there, while she was walking in the commons, there was a protest going on of students who were protesting Richard Nixon's bombing of Cambodia in Vietnam. And in the midst of the riot that was beginning to emerge, National Guardsmen started to shoot their guns at the students. And this young lady, who's now an older woman, says that day is still embedded in her mind. She remembers it like yesterday, and what she remembers is that it was all a fog. There was just mass confusion. And I can imagine in this riot outside of the temple in Jerusalem, where people are throwing off their clothes and taking dirt and throwing it into the air and stomping and yelling, there was this same sense of danger, and rationality did not prevail, and mistakes were made. But now, in the torture chamber, in the pre-terror moments before Paul is flogged, he says, "I'm a Roman citizen," and he's heard. And the centurion listens. You know, they train police officers to step back and listen, try to get a handle on the situation, because emotions can start flaring up. Tend to what is the law. Tend to what is right. And here, this soldier begins to do that in this instance. And he decides, I'm going to my commanding officer. And he says, this guy says he's a Roman citizen. And he's probably afraid for himself because he knows it's illegal to do what he's about to do. So he's watching out for his own skin. And Claudius Lysias, the Roman commander, he comes in, he questions Paul, and he realizes that he's a Roman citizen. So he designs to save him and to transfer him to Roman authorities in the provincial capital, not in Jerusalem, but over in Caesarea in a seacoast town. And when he goes to Caesarea, the radical fanatics who have this jihadist desire to kill Paul, there's 40 men who have made an oath in order to try to ambush him while he's being transferred. But Paul has a nephew. Isn't it nice to have loyal, dedicated family members who support you? And his nephew, his sister's son, comes and warns the guards that this plot is underway. And Claudius, let's say, he makes way with an assortment of troops to escort Paul to his safety. Now, when Paul gets to Caesarea, he's transferred to this guy whose name is Felix. Now, Tacitus, the Roman historian, writes about Felix. He says he was one of the most immoral, disgusting leaders that the Romans ever had as a governor. And Josephus was even more unkind to him because he says he hired a magician to go and trick this Jewish woman who was the daughter of Herod the king into leaving her first husband and marrying him as his second wife. So he tricks this woman, and she's no pure innocent victim in this either, because she is really wanting to move to a position of power because she's in this conflict with her sister Bernice and with her brother Agrippa II, and so she's happy to kind of get out of the Herod's realm and to go into this Roman realm. Eventually, she makes it all the way to Rome, and she goes down near Vesuvius, and she dies in the eruption of Vesuvius when that volcano goes off. But Drusilla and Felix are now the ones who are in charge of Paul. Not the best, most respectable government officials one could know. And yet, they're the ones that have the authority. And what they do is they take 2 years of going into Paul and questioning him. And in the midst of questioning him, they're probably just trying to stretch out the time so that they can collect a bribe from him. Luke tells us they're trying to get a bribe. And who knows, they probably were from Paul's family and from Paul's friends. And at the same time, Felix was probably getting bribes from the fanatics who wanted to kill him as well. And he was holding out the possibility that he would release them to him. So Felix is no good guy. And eventually he was replaced by another person named Portus Festus. And Festus comes and hears Paul's case. You know how the legal proceedings go like this? Any of you have legal proceedings that last a month or 2 or 3 or 2 years or stretch out to 3? You know, he's in the midst of one of these. And in every case, he's trying to be faithful to God. In every situation, he's trying to shine for Jesus. In every opportunity he has to make a confession before people, the confession that he makes is that I confess my faith in Jesus Christ, who is supreme and who is a king of all. Every situation he talks like this. And Festus meets with him. And Festus doesn't see anything really wrong with him. And yet Paul knows that there's those 40 fanatical, religious murderers who are out to kill him. You know, you always got to question, when someone's religion leads them to hate. Something's not quite right. But these people took a vow, a devout religious vow, to kill Paul. And Paul knows the minute he gets out, they're going to be waiting for him, to ambush him. So when Festus is questioning Paul, Paul finally says, I appeal to Caesar. And this is kind of like putting forward a legal appeal, making a formal appeal in like an American court of law. You file your papers and you're off to court. Well, that's what Paul has done. He has made an official claim to be able to go to court in Rome, to the emperor's court. And what Felix does is he consults his legal advisors, and in the midst of consulting his legal advisors, he says, "To Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you will go." And he sends him off. But before he sends him off, he has to produce this legal brief. And so what does Festus do in producing a legal brief? He goes to the king of the Jews, who's playing his own kind of Game of Thrones himself. He's a vassal leader he doesn't have the iron throne like is in Rome that the emperor has, but he has his little throne, and it's enough power for him. And he's married to Bernice. Well, he's not married to her, he's just living with her. Because, I told you, it's like Game of Thrones. And they're in this incestuous relationship. And so this Herod, Agrippa II, interviews Paul. And as he interviews Paul, he says, "You know what? I don't see anything wrong with him." And all Paul does is says, "I'd love to share with you the difference that Jesus makes in your life." And as Herod listens, Herod knows all about Jesus. I mean, how could he not know about Jesus? And yet he is so addicted to the power of his throne that he's not willing to abandon that for a higher king. But in the end, he kind of cynically says, "You've appealed to Caesar, so you could go free as far as I'm concerned. But since you got this court case going, I guess you're going to have to go to Rome." There's a lot of people, scholars, who believe that the book of Acts was written by Luke as his own legal brief in defense of Paul, to be a contrary supporting evidence that would go to the emperor in Rome, in contrast to the kind of legal brief that Festus prepared. And what people do is they cite some of the legal languages, especially that Luke uses at the preamble to his gospel account. He talks about, "I'm giving eyewitnesses, I'm providing you this testimony, I've investigated this evidence thoroughly." He uses all this kind of legal language. And also, as Luke writes, he describes how at the end of Acts, Paul just gets to Rome and he's still a prisoner awaiting trial. And in his gospel account, he describes how Pilate declares 3 different times that Jesus is innocent. In his Acts account, he describes 3 different times that these various leaders, Agrippa II, Festus, and Felix, all say Paul is innocent. And so some people believe that Luke is actually providing this text as a legal brief for this man who is in Rome, who's a lawyer named Theophilus, who this is addressed to. I'm not sure if that's absolutely true. It can be argued for or against, but the one thing I'm pretty sure of is this part of the text from chapters 21 to 26 probably was a legal brief that Luke inserted into his history of the early church. Like, some people will write a blog, and then they'll take that blog and they'll put it as a chapter in their book. Or a student might do some research, and then they'll put it into their dissertation as separate information. Well, that's kind of what Luke could be doing here. And he's trying to prove that Paul is a faithful citizen of Rome, and he's done nothing illegal that he should be put to death for. As I read this, one of the things that stands out to me is that through it all, Paul stays faithful, not just to his Roman citizenship, but to a higher kingship of Jesus. And for me, this raises the question for all of us, in the midst of situations that we experience, in the midst of our living in this country with all of our rights and responsibilities, where is our ultimate loyalty and where does it belong? Thinking back to Paul, he says, "I pray for my government officials so that they will help us to live in peace with godliness and with dignity towards all. That's what he saw the role of the country for. But to Jesus, he gave his entire life. That's where his ultimate loyalty was as a citizen of the kingdom of God. You know, I have a friend who was summoned to court recently, and he said, I'm really trying to apply my Christian faith to this situation. He says, no matter what happens, I want to shine for Jesus. I want to shine for Christ. I want my life to be a witness to all concerned of what difference Jesus makes in our life. I think that that's a noble thing to learn from a text like this. That's certainly the way that Paul was. And so I prayed for my friend. I said, I pray that he will shine for Christ. And I also pray that he will be victorious in court. And wouldn't it be nice if in every situation we could both be victorious and shine for Christ? But sometimes we have to make a choice. And I say, let's always shine for Christ. Every once in a while, we can come up with a government agency where there's an incompetent person or somebody who's in some way compromised in leadership. Every once in a while, the wheels of justice don't spin quite like you want them to. And the question becomes, can we still shine for Christ in the midst of that? That's something to think about when we're unfurling our flags and hanging them out during this season.